Hello everyone, welcome to JS Gigs and my name is Deepak. As we had seen in the previous tutorial that we had installed NgRx, we had also installed Angular Material, and we had also installed Angular latest version, right? So in this tutorial, I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of each of these files which gets created from the CLI. And also we are going to be creating a base store, right? So let's just quickly start with the file overview. So here is the VS Code. So in the VS Code, you can see that this is a base project after installation of all the files. Now you can see here at the GitHub icon that I have, these are the files which have changed after the installation. So let me quickly open the Package.json. So if you open Package.json, then you can see that Angular CDK, Angular animation, and all the other things. So it's a 17th version which I'm using, which is the latest version of Angular. And also the JSON server is 100 alpha 23. And if you come down, that's pretty much it. Now let me quickly take you to the Angular.json. So in Angular.json, you can see that the deep purple is the theme that we had used, right? So this is the entry after adding the ng-add command for the Angular material and selecting the deep purple theme. So this is the CSS file which gets added here at the styles. And if you go further in the top, you would notice that it is there at the build and under the architect object. Right, so now we are done with AngularJSon, Package.json, and now let's just the setting.json is a file which is basically for my VS Code. So I've done some basic change in the VS Code settings. So this is not really important for you to see. So I'm not going to be talking about settings.json, but then if you want to know about this, please do write in the comment section below, and I'll probably try to create a separate video around how to use VS Code better. Right, so now let me open index.html. Here in the index.html, as you may have noticed that there are two files which gets created, or rather the added when we add the Angular material. These two files precisely hold fonts which are required for your Angular material to run, and as well as the icons which are required in your Angular material library. Right, so now looking at styles.scss also, it tells us what are the font that we are going to be using, and then the font level entry has already been made in the index.js, as we have seen just a moment from now. And styles.scss, wherein all these styles are added and the global fonts are set, the height and body which is made as 100%, which is precisely the first step that every one of us in the UI would basically do before creating an application, so that your head and body and precisely the HTML and the body is expanded. Okay, so moving on next, the next change is, or the next file which got changed is app.config, in which we have basically initiated the store like this by providing a provide store. And also notice that there is a point that I'm trying to make is that when you are using store in module based application or in standalone component based application, the usage and the methods are a little different, right? So now you can see that the moment I had added the NgRx store, it had created a provide store here at the root appconfig.ts file, right? So now here is the router, and here is the provide animation async. This is basically for the platform browser, from the platform browser, and then provide store is basically from the NgRx, right? So far so good. Now let's just quickly go back to, let me just close everything up from here. Okay, so before I move any further, I would want to commit these file changes first. So let me write a commit message here. So the commit message I'm going to be writing is do a commit and publish branch. I'm going to be making this a public repository, and then it takes a moment and then publishes the entire project to the GitHub. So student entry is basically the name of the repository, with the public view access would have been created under my name, Deepak Jha14, right? So it's pretty much done. All right, so before I start coding about before I start to code the component and the table, I would want to take you to the Chrome browser and I want to talk about the NgRx now. Right, so now here I am at the NgRx official web page or official documentation, so to say. So here, if you can just click on the state, and under that state you need to click on the NgRx store, and under that you just need to click why use store. Right, so if you click over here, you would notice that this page opens up, and now I'm going to talk about the concept behind NgRx or the concept behind Redux. Right, so NgRx is nothing but a wrapper around Redux. So what is Redux? Redux is basically a design pattern and also a very popular library, predominantly or primarily used for state management. And NgRx is basically a wrapper that is accepted, that is written in TypeScript, and something which is used in Angular application very often, right? So why use NgRx, or why not use NgRx, and when to use Redux and when not to use Redux, or is there any other pattern available apart from Redux? So let me just answer all these questions one by one. Right, the first one, why use NgRx store for state management? So if your application is pretty big such that it requires multiple different components to talk to one another, and you also have an application which needs to be hydrated whenever you move from one component to the other, or when your application deals with a lot of data that is required for each and every component, and the communication between the components and the data is pretty huge, that is when you would use state management tool, and precisely the NgRx. And right, the idea behind using the Redux is pretty much same. Right, when should I use NgRx store for state management? So here is a good guideline available from the NgRx documentation, as you can see, that if it follows the SHARI principle, SHARI principle, you must consider using NgRx. Please understand that NgRx is not a magic bullet. It will not really work on all the scenarios, as in, like, if your application is small and you don't really have too much interaction happening between the component, then my personal suggestion to you is to not really use and make it complicated. Try to make it work with the @ input or @ output, or by using the state management solution, by building these state management singleton services in your application. Use those, and don't really fall for NgRx or anything similar to this, because it's going to make your application a little more complex to code. But it'll solve a problem, only when your application is pretty huge and it follows these SHARI principles. So what are those SHARI principles per se? Right, so let's just talk about all of these one by one. So first is shared. So which means if your state is accessed by many different component and services, that's when you call it shared. Right, so what is H stands for in SHARI? Hydrated. So what do you mean by that? In the state that is persisted and rehydrated from external storage. What is A stands for in SHARI? A stands for availability or available. State that needs to be available when re-entering routes, right? What is R stands for in SHARI? It's basically retrieved, which means that state that must be retrieved with a side effect. So we'll talk about what side effects are. Side effects are essentially asynchronous calls. Asynchronous calls meaning the API calls, the HTTP get, put, post, all of these methods whenever you try to receive any data from the get, and these are, as by the nature of it, is they are asynchronous. These are basically dealt by the side effect, and these are the one which are called side effect in NgRx or in Redux terminology, right? So what is I stands for? What is I stands for in SHARI? I stands for impacted. So what do you mean by that? So it means that the state that is impacted by actions from other sources. What it's essentially trying to say is that if your current state is affected by multiple different components, something which I've already spoken about when I was talking about the NgRx at first place, right? So when your application follow this SHARI principle, you must consider using the NgRx. But as I said, that NgRx is not a magic bullet. It only works for the larger and complex pages, complex application. If you're trying to use it in a relatively smaller application, yes, it can work, but then it'll just increase complexity for you. It will not really make your life any better, right? So if you want to make your life better try to use better don't use NgRx in case if you feel your application is small and doesn't really follow all these principles, SHARI principle, as we have spoken about, right? So just recently I was working on an application which basically revolves around settling the trade in the trading company. So I was using an application which renders a lot of data, which renders roughly about 12,000 rows and 12,000 records, and a user can see and can interact with and then do multiple operations on those. So wherein a lot of interaction was required from the user side, and that's where I had used NgRx store precisely. But then I had also built application last year or before that wherein I did not really realize that NgRx would really make any sense to the application that I'm building. So that's why I did not use. So please understand that's not a magic bullet. It works only for the complex application. It will work for the smaller application as well, but it will not be really useful, because if you're trying to use NgRx, please understand that it also require you to write down a lot of boilerplate code. That boilerplate code basically revolves around a concept called Redux, or the design pattern called Redux and singleton stores, right? So now if you look at further down below, you would see that the key concept, so type safety, it is essentially revolves around the TypeScript type safety, immutability, and performance. So please understand that whenever we are trying to read a particular data from the store by using the selectors, so basically selectors are used to read the data from the store. So these selectors, when you use, they are memoized, meaning when you read the data and you try to read that again the next time, it'll basically try to store those values in the cache and would return you response unless if it has changed. So that's how it improves the performance of reading. Encapsulation basically so encapsulation meaning basically using the NgRx effects and store any interaction with the external resources or side effect, which I precisely spoke about a moment ago, that is the HTTP calls, are revolved around the encapsulation logic, and then all this logic is written here and then can be used, and such that you can determine that when your application store would be available or state would be available or data slice would be available. That's something which we would talk about in the encapsulation. Serializability, by normalizing state changes and passing them through the observables, NgRx provides serializability and ensure that the state is predictably stored. This allows state to be saved to external storage such as local storage. Right, so there's another thing that we need to be careful about, and then obviously when you're using the NgRx tool and using and you are doing a type safety and all the other principle and the usage of Redux or NgRx, it becomes a lot more testable, and also you can basically provide the mock store and mock actions and mock data while you are testing the application. Through that, you can really see what really runs in your application and can test the unit and can do the unit testing also pretty well. So this is all about the NgRx store. Now let me quickly take you to the whiteboard, and here I'm trying to basically draw your attention to how the NgRx store would really work, right, and how we are going to be using that in our application. So you may have noticed that we have 3 pages on our web application, right? So we're going to be building 3 main components, right? So one is the login page. The other is essentially a table wherein you would see the entered student's name and their basic details. The third one is the contact us page, right? So I'll write down C. So when we do from login, or when we move from login to the table, it basically requires us to make an API call, and that API call would return some data, and that's how we would reach here at the table. And from table to component, there is no interaction really required, or from table to contact us, there is no interaction basically required. But then if you want to have some more features available, and then if you want your component to read some more state, that you can do. Right, so your store essentially will sit at the top of your application. So let me just write down store. So this store would be basically used to do the communication between the component. So your table would basically be able to read and store the value over here, and similarly login would be able to read and write the values over here. I beg your pardon, there is another component that we're going to be building, is basically to enter the student's name, student's entry form, right? So here also we would do interaction with this store, and then this interaction would basically take place between the store and the student's entry form, and then we'll save the data, and then the same data is being read by the table component as well. So we are not going to be basically writing the @ symbol, or we are not going to be writing the @ input or output in order to interact with multiple components. And also we are not going to be basically writing singleton service in order to communicate with one another. But rather what we would do is like we will set up the store, and that's what we would use basically to communicate with each and every component, and also store the API data and things like that, right? So this is what we are going to be doing. And now let me take you to the NgRx. There is another thing that I want to bring your attention to, which is the getting started portion of this. So here, if you look at your NgRx carefully, you would realize that NgRx, basically this is the architecture of the NgRx store, right? So here in the NgRx, you can see that the store, which is or the NgRx store. So if you look closely over here, you would realize that the component is talking to store through actions and reducer. Similarly, the component is able to read the store value or the incoming value through the selector, and through which it reads the value and then uses it. You may notice that there is no direct link between the component and store, and there is no direct link between the store and the component. So what are the two possible ways of interacting with the store for a particular component? It is either through selector when you are trying to read a state, and if you're trying to basically write down on this state, it is through action. So we will talk about selectors and action in a moment when we really create an application, but just try to understand that that's how it is going to be initiating it. Now, if you look closely here, you would notice that the component initiates an action, and that action initiates an effect. So effects is basically all the side effects, as we have spoken about in the past, just a few minutes from now, as we have spoken about briefly a few minutes ago. So effects is essentially whenever you are trying to read any data from the async mechanism, or by making an HTTP call, it is done through effects. And also you may notice that component is not directly doing the effects. It is basically calling an action, and that action is triggering an effect, and then that particular effect, the data which is received, is stored in the store through reducer. So now if you look closely, action also does not really write down value directly in the store. It is basically interacting with the store through the reducer. And also notice that there is no other link which is joining from store to action. So action can only communicate with the store in a one way, meaning through reducer, and then reducer basically makes a change in the store. So this is a Redux pattern, and this is what we are going to be implementing in NgRx, and we will see in a short while from now that how selector, component, action, reducer, and effects work in tandem. But just understand that each of this particular diagram, we are going to be coming back to this diagram on and off again, and then we will talk about it in a pretty detailed manner, why it is really needed per se. But then understand that your Redux pattern work in this fashion and manner. All right, so I believe by now you would be clear as how to really install all the softwares required to run the NgRx in your application. And I think we have already given you I've already given you an overview of this particular file, which is app.config.json, app.config.ts, in which I have already spoken about provide store, what it stands for, and things like that, right? So now what I'm going to do is like I'm going to be basically initializing the application with the core state or the base state, and then on top of it we will try to create a reducer, action, selectors, and many other entities around Redux and NgRx. But then before that, let me quickly take you to browser and show you a Chrome extension which is absolutely needed and required in order to run this in order to debug the application properly, and to also understand and visually see how your application state is flaring up. So for that, this is the application that we have been trying to build, and let me just right click and inspect element, and then let me do one thing. Okay, so here's the thing. So you need to Google about the Redux DevTools in Chrome, and then once you really need to open the first link over here. And once you open this link, you would realize that, well, in my case, I already have this available in my Chrome extension. So that's the reason why it is not really saying to add it, and rather it says that to remove from my Chrome. just in case if you don't have it added. So what would happen, like you will have an icon like this, as I've just recently removed, and it asked me to bring it back. So I just need to click on add extension, and it's pretty much sorted. After a moment it'll get installed and you will be able to see the application, right? So now in order to see the Redux dev tool, you will have to click on the Redux over here, and then once you'll open it, now you can see the dev tool is already available, right? So this is essentially is the idea of installing the Redux dev tool. Now you can close this tab, and let me quickly take you back to the code editor. Now here in the code editor, we really need to install the extension settings, right? So there is another library that we will have to install in order to debug the application in Chrome dev tool, in Redux dev tool, and the library for that purpose is called NgRx store dev tool. So let me do the npmi. So as you can see over here in the right hand side bottom corner, I am trying to install the dependency, which is with the save tab, with the save flag, which is NgRx / store dev tools. So once you click on once you press and enter, it'll take a moment and install the application locally in your install the library locally in your system. And now we really need to set this up. So let me and need I mention that we are building this entire application in standalone mode. So in a standalone mode and module based mode, it is slightly different from one another in terms of how you initialize the application. So now you can see I'm just writing down the code which is required to set up the store first, and second I'm also going to be putting the core logic to install or to see the state using the dev tool. In order to do so, you will have to basically write down the provide store dev tool function, which is part of the library that we have just recently installed, which is store dev tool. So let me just write it down here, and also do an import. And this comes from NgRx store dev tool. Just need to copy this, put this here, save it, and that's pretty much it. Right, so now we have installed the store dev tool, and I provided the max age and other basic properties in it. I'll talk about these in pretty much detail, and but for now just hang on with me, and then for now just tag along with. For now, just stay along, just listen to what I'm saying, and then we'll deep dive into each of these functions and their utilities in a moment. So now we are going to be installing, or rather putting the state. So in order to have a state in your application, you really need to create a folder called state. So once you create a folder called state, inside that we'll have to first of all create an architecture, or rather the interface or the type for the state we are going to be having. So in order to do so, I'll basically create a file called students record ts, and then I'll also try to create a reducer. But before that, let me just try quickly create a records.ts file, which is going to be an interface, rather the type required for students record to be entered. In order to do so, let me first create a file, students-records.ts, and then I'm also going to be creating a reducer. So students hyphen, or rather dot, yes. And now let me open students records ts, and here in the students record ts, I'm going to be creating a quick interface. So this interface is basically, these are the details which I'm going to be entering from the form, and these are the details which I'm going to be showing in the table. So these are the one which I need to write down here at the students-record.ts. and now in the students reducer.ts, I'm going to be writing the base reducer. So in order to write it down, we'll have to put const export and I'm going to be making it as, let's say, init state, and this is going to be read only array of type students records, and then inside that I'm basically going to be creating a record. So let's just say, let's just create a base state here, and here is the base state for me. So name debug country, let me just India. Let me write it down, yes, in both the cases. All right. Is spelling mistake here. All right, so I think now we have created an initial state, and now I'm going to be creating a reducer. So this reducer basically is created here in the NgRx using a function called create reducer, and that create reducer is a part of a, the create reducer function is a part of a NgRx store, right? So init state here, and then let me just import the create reducer from NgRx store. So in order to do so, I'll have to write it down this. Please excuse me, I've got a new keyboard and that's why my hands are not properly setting up here and I'm making some typos, right? So bear with me, and let's just put this here, and that's pretty much it, right? So now we have created the reducer. We have also created an interface which will basically give our application a way to write or to read. Is in our application a skeleton of a record. So like, what are the properties that record particularly is going to be having? And now we'll quickly go back to appconfig.ts, and there is another last setting that we will have to do. So just note here, we have imported provide store from NgRx store. We have imported provide store dev tool from NgRx store dev tool, and then there is another function called provide state. So this one, and then this provide state is also going to be part of basically the store. So let me just import this provide state, and this provide state is going to be having a key value pair of two properties precisely. The first one is a name, and then the other one is a reducer. So let's just say students records, and let me also import the reducer here at the top. So let me write down this piece of code, and yes, we are now sorted. So I think let me just quickly give you a recap of what we have essentially done. We have taken a few imports of, let's say, a few import of some functions called provide store, provide state, and provide store dev tool, and these are part of the two different libraries. One is the NgRx store, the other one is NgRx store dev tools. NgRx store DevTools, this particular line is needed, which is written at line number 20, is basically to initiate the DevTools such that you can debug your application state from the browser itself in a very beautiful manner. Right, so now let me quickly take you to the Chrome browser, and here at the Chrome browser, I'll quickly give this a refresh, the application which we have recently been building, and click on the state. Here the state, if I open, now you can see that the application has created a base state along with the function, along with an object that I've created in the init state, and that's something which you can see over here. So now we have set up everything successfully. We have set up the store, we have set up the store dev tool, we have also set up the application and installed all the required libraries needed. In the next tutorial onwards, we are going to be talking about selector, reducer, actions, and all the other things in a much more detail. But I think for now, this is pretty much it. And now I'm going to be wrapping this tutorial up, and then I'll see you in the next one, in which we will create the table and also try to create multiple different entities which are required for your state to run. But before I wind up, I also want to bring your attention to something which is called Flux, right? So Redux, we have already spoken about. Redux is essentially the library underneath the NgRx. NgRx is an Angular-based wrapper on top of a Redux library. Now, there is another thing that I want to bring your attention to, which is called Flux. Flux is another state management pattern which was earlier used, and now people use store much more prominently than anything else, or rather the Redux much more prominently than anything else. The reason behind using Redux over Flux is that the Flux used to basically have store or the state on a module level, or rather on a component level, whereas NgRx or the Redux provided a state or an application state based on an application which is at the top of the page, or rather the top of the application. So your state is shared across multiple different components, and your state is created once, and your state your state is something which is shared by all the components in your application. Whereas in case of Flux, it used to be a component or a module based, wherein you would create a state, but then that state would only be accessible within the component or in the module, right? So that's the main difference between Flux and Redux. And then we have been using NgRx, which is again as a wrapper, as I said earlier, which is basically a wrapper on top of a Redux. And Flux was another pattern which was used earlier, but now still there are some people who use or prefer Flux over Redux, but then I personally prefer Redux as it provides a lot many benefits. Although if you look at the architecture of both these libraries or both these patterns, it's pretty much the same, except the fact that in case of Redux, the entire state is being shared across all the components and it's a single state, and then you create multiple different feature and other entities within the state. But in case of Flux, it is component or a module based shared entity, right? So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be finishing up this tutorial, and if you're liking my work, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also hit the bell icon in case if I create another video, you would be notified. Thank you very much once again, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to be seeing you in the next tutorial. Thank you.